Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. On the morning of April the 2nd, 2025, a man in Waldorf, Maryland, called 911. His voice was clear, unshaken. He said his girlfriend hadn't come home. She'd left the night before, he claimed after an argument. She hadn't returned. But her car was still in the driveway. Their two young children were inside the home, unharmed. Her phone was still on the kitchen counter, powered off. And Lesbia Milith Ramirez Guerra, 23 years old, was gone. The Charles County Sheriff's Office dispatched officers to the residence. At first, the report read like a standard missing persons case. No signs of forced entry, no visible blood, no overturned furniture. The home was quiet, intact, too intact. Lesbia's handbag was still hanging by the front door. Her identification and credit cards were inside. There was no sign of packing or departure. Her vehicle, a beat-up Honda Civic, hadn't been moved. The driver's seat was positioned exactly where she kept it. It wasn't just that she had left in a hurry. It was that she hadn't taken anything with her, not even her shoes. Officers canvassed the area. A neighbor living two houses down provided the only usable surveillance footage. Her home security system had picked up motion in the early hours of April 1st, around 1:43 a.m. The video showed a figure dragging what appeared to be a large rectangular object from the back door toward the yard. The quality was poor, no facial identification, no license plate, but the object was large enough, heavy enough, that it required both hands and careful maneuvering. Inside the home, the rear kitchen floor appeared freshly cleaned, too freshly. When investigators sprayed luminol, a chemical used to detect latent blood, faint organic traces emerged along the grout lines near the baseboards and under the table legs. A hasty cleanup had been done. It wasn't visible to the naked eye, but the chemical reaction was unmistakable. A search of the hallway closet just outside the kitchen triggered interest from the K-9 unit. The dog alerted twice, though no physical remains were recovered. Still, the scent marker was logged. This wasn't about what was found. It was about what was no longer there. One of the responding detectives, cross-referencing earlier walkthrough reports, noticed a discrepancy. In photographs taken weeks prior by a social worker, related to an unrelated welfare inspection, a large plastic storage bin could be seen in the hallway, tucked next to a vacuum. It was missing now. The bin, roughly 50 gallons in capacity, wasn't something you'd misplace easily. A neighbor confirmed she'd seen it just days before when dropping off some donated clothes for the children. With no sign of a voluntary departure and mounting physical inconsistencies, the case was escalated. By April 3rd, it was no longer being treated as a disappearance. Lesbia's phone was extracted for digital analysis. Her last activity had been logged just before 1 a.m. on April 1st. One draft message was recovered from her unsent folder. It read, "If something happens, just know I love them more than life. Don't forget me." It had never been sent. Officers questioned the man who had made the 911 call, Kesey Robinson Alexis Barrera Rosa. He was calm, rehearsed. He explained they'd had an argument about money and that Lesbia needed space. He suggested she may have gone to stay with a friend. But when asked to name that friend, he couldn't. When asked if he'd searched for her or called her phone, he said no. He didn't want to make things worse. But the data told a different story. Cell phone tower pings placed Barrera Rosa near Cedarville State Forest between 2 a.m. and 3:30 a.m. on April 1st. He hadn't mentioned this trip. When confronted, he said he'd gone out to clear his head. There were no messages, no calls, just movement, alone in the dark, with no alibi and no clear reason to be in a remote forest area. Investigators pulled nearby commercial surveillance footage from April 1st. One receipt, timestamped at 10:23 p.m. on March 31st, showed a cash purchase at a local Walmart. One industrial-grade 50-gallon storage bin, a pack of contractor trash bags, and a bottle of heavy-duty cleaner. The store's cameras confirmed the buyer, Barrera Rosa. The pattern forming wasn't subtle, it was structured, deliberate, quiet. Detectives began to piece together a timeline. Lesbia was last seen alive around 11:00 p.m. on March 31st. Surveillance captured Barrera Rosa purchasing cleaning supplies just before midnight. By 1:43 a.m., he was seen dragging a large object across the lawn. By 2 a.m., he was driving south, in the direction of Cedarville, and by morning he claimed she had just walked out. Yet no one, not one witness, neighbor, or traffic camera, had seen her leave. At this point, authorities stopped looking for a missing woman. They began looking for a body. And the more they uncovered, the clearer it became. Someone had gone to great lengths to make sure Lesbia would not be found. But they had made a mistake. The home at 11,008 Park Waldorf Lane didn't scream crime scene. It whispered. And investigators were trained to listen when a house went quiet. On April 4th, 2 days after the missing persons report was filed, crime scene technicians re-entered the residence under a criminal search warrant. The focus shifted. This wasn't about finding a missing person anymore. This was about identifying what had been done to her and where. Technicians started from the back. The rear door showed no signs of forced entry, but the tile floor inside the kitchen had already flagged suspicion during initial walkthroughs. This time, forensic analysts took samples of the clean surface and tested for chemical agents. Confirmed. A high concentration of ammonia-based disinfectant, inconsistent with the household's typical cleaning products. Under alternate light sources, low-level organic residue traced along the baseboards, partial but consistent with hemoglobin detection previously indicated by luminol. At the threshold to the garage, trace particulate was found embedded in the crevice between the floor and door frame. Soil embedded with fine root matter and granulated red clay, not consistent with the home's landscaping. Samples were bagged for lab comparison. The closet adjacent to the kitchen again drew interest. A second K9 pass reinforced initial alert. Chemical sniffers later confirmed elevated scent markers indicative of decomposition at some point in recent past. No visual evidence remained, but the scent lingered. Digital forensics now played a role. A desktop computer inside the living room had a history of recent searches. Some wiped, others recoverable. Among the queries logged in late March, how deep to bury a body, how long before a missing person is declared dead, how to clean blood from tile grout. The user account was unprotected. Investigators preserved the logs, as well as a series of manually deleted browser sessions on March 31st, precisely during the time frame in which Lesbia was last seen. Meanwhile, an inventory of household items confirmed a 50-gallon plastic bin previously seen in the home was no longer present. A neighbor had photographed the children during a visit days earlier. In the background, partially cropped, the bin could be seen. A casual detail turned critical evidence. No matching bin was located inside the house, garage, or immediate perimeter. Officers conducted a grid search of the backyard and trash collection area. The local waste service confirmed no bulk pickups had been scheduled by the household in the past 30 days. No bin of that size was recorded at any drop site associated with the address. Investigators extended their focus beyond the house. The suspect's cell tower data, already retrieved, showed prolonged signal presence around the Cedarville State Forest between 2 and 3:30 a.m. on April 1st. It wasn't just a pass-through. The pings were clustered. The vehicle remained stationary within a 900-meter radius for over an hour, enough time to dispose of something, or someone. With this information, a search plan was organized. Ground teams with cadaver dogs, drones with infrared, and forensic botanists coordinated with state forest rangers. The area was wide, largely undeveloped, and conditions were muddy from recent rainfall. Forensic strategy now focused on matching the soil composition recovered inside the kitchen to topographic samples from the state forest grid. If the clay matched, it would validate presence and likely movement between two locations that shouldn't have shared soil. One analyst from the lab noted, the particles were too specific. The root fragments, the clay type. It wasn't just soil. It was evidence someone tried to bring the outdoors back inside, then tried to wash it away. Even without a body, the evidence was mounting. Something had happened in that house, and the forest only just miles away had become a silent witness. She didn't have a voice in the investigation until detectives gave her one. When someone disappears, the public instinct is often to ask what they were running from. But when investigators dug into Lesbia Ramirez-Guerra's life, the more accurate question became, why didn't anyone see this coming sooner? Lesbia was 23, Born in Guatemala, she came to the United States in 2019 under circumstances common to many undocumented women, fleeing instability, working jobs below minimum wage, trying to raise her children in a country that didn't fully recognize her existence. She didn't have a credit score. She didn't file taxes, but she had two young children under 5, a steady rhythm of childcare work, and a tight circle of immigrant women in the Waldorf area who helped each other survive. Her coworkers described her as private, responsible, never late for a shift. She kept to herself, rarely joined after-hours meetups, and always left early to get back to her kids. Most of her texts to colleagues involved schedules and pickups. Nothing dramatic. But in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, there were changes. A friend from the local Catholic Outreach Center told detectives that Lesbia had recently started asking about relocation resources. Not shelter, just information. Quiet, cautious inquiries. When asked if she ever explained why, the friend said, "She didn't have to. She looked like someone thinking ahead." The digital evidence matched that intuition. On her phone, recovered from the kitchen counter, and now fully imaged by investigators, Lesbia had bookmarked multiple pages related to domestic violence support for undocumented residents. A text draft saved 5 days before she vanished read, "Is there a way to leave without getting police involved?" It had not been sent. Investigators noted this draft while comparing activity logs. Lesbia hadn't deleted it. She had saved it, as if she intended to come back to it later. But time ran out. Through device location data, analysts reconstructed her final known movements. On March 31st, she had taken her usual route, dropped her youngest at daycare at 8:15 a.m., worked a shift at a local bakery until 3:45 p.m., stopped by a convenience store around 4:10 p.m. to pick up diapers, and returned home by 4:30. No data, cameras, or witnesses placed her anywhere after that point. There was one final confirmed contact. At 6:42 p.m., she exchanged brief texts with her closest friend. Nothing unusual. Just a quick check-in. The final message from Lesbia was short. "Home now. Talk soon." She never responded again. With the forest grid search already underway and evidence building toward external body disposal, detectives now refocused partially on behavioral forensics. A timeline of stressors, triggers, and precursors. Lesbia didn't leave behind a journal, but her text logs offered patterns. An uptick in searches about restraining orders, sudden pauses in message threads where she'd once replied instantly, multiple days where location services were toggled off manually. One investigator remarked, "She didn't run, she was planning to, but intent doesn't guarantee safety, especially when someone else takes control of that timeline." Back at the residence, officers interviewed neighbors again. One, a woman in the unit beside Lesbia's, told police she had heard repeated arguments over the past few months, escalating in both frequency and volume. On one occasion in March, she nearly called the police after hearing what sounded like something heavy fall, followed by silence. But she hesitated. "She had kids," the neighbor said, "and I didn't want to make it worse." That hesitation echoed a broader theme. Lesbia lived in a system designed to keep her invisible, undocumented, unprotected, unheard. Her financial profile, reconstructed through app data and third-party remittance tools, showed that she had saved a small emergency fund, just over $300 spread across 2 mobile platforms. Investigators also recovered screenshots of a bus schedule between Maryland and North Carolina. The date of departure was set for April the 2nd. She had never booked the ticket. By now, investigators had enough circumstantial data to suggest that Lesbia wasn't just a missing person. She had made quiet attempts to escape her situation, digitally, emotionally, logistically, but never got the chance to act. The silence around her life hadn't been accidental. It had been constructed. Forensics told investigators what might have happened. Behavioral data began to explain why. The timeline was already under pressure. By April 5th, 2025, investigators had physical evidence from the home, behavioral signals from Lesbia's digital footprint, and GPS coordinates placing a potential suspect near Cedarville State Forest for over an hour during the early morning hours of April 1st. What they needed next was corroboration and a concrete chain of actions that would hold under forensic scrutiny. They started with receipts. Using the suspect's known phone number, investigators pulled transactional metadata from local retail chains. One purchase stood out immediately. A Walmart transaction logged on March 31st at 10:23 p.m., paid in cash. The items: one 50-gallon industrial-grade plastic bin, one 32-count contractor trash bag roll, and a 1-gallon jug of bleach-based heavy-duty floor cleaner. Surveillance footage from that Walmart confirmed the buyer. Same clothing, same gait, same person who had earlier claimed he was asleep during that window. The cashier remembered the transaction, not because it seemed criminal, but because it was odd to see someone buying those three items together that late at night, paying in cash, and then rushing out without a bag. The location of that Walmart, Route 301, Brandywine, was just 11 miles north of the Cedarville Forest perimeter. It was also only 15 minutes from the residence. Investigators mapped the movement pattern from the store to the house using existing cell tower triangulation. The suspect's device remained idle at the Walmart until 10:32 p.m., then was back at the residence by 10:49 p.m. The entire loop was consistent with the timing of the purchase and aligned with the start of Lesbia's digital silence. None of this was enough for an arrest, but it did provide what law enforcement refer to as intent sequence indicators, a pattern of premeditated behavior that includes equipment acquisition, route planning, and concealment measures, all within a short, actionable window. Back at the residence, crime scene technicians revisited the garage based on the Walmart bin dimensions. They discovered faint scrape marks on the threshold between the interior tile and the doorframe, straight-line abrasions consistent with hard plastic contact. Analysts photographed the pattern and compared it against a control sample bin from the same Walmart chain. The results matched within 2 millimeters. Additionally, trace residue found in the hallway consisted of polyethylene microfibers, consistent with the contractor-grade trash bags purchased that night. By April 6th, forensic analysts had compiled the following progression. 10:23 p.m. Purchase made, bin, bags, cleaner. 10:49 p.m. Buyer returns home. 12:57 a.m. Lesbia's last known draft messages typed but unsent. 1:43 a.m. Neighbor's camera captures object being dragged behind the residence. 3:30 a.m. GPS logs a trip to Cedarville State Forest. What investigators lacked, critically, was confirmation of what had been placed inside the bin. That changed slightly when a second round of interviews turned up a previously overlooked detail. A delivery driver for a third-party grocery service reported seeing a large black bin placed in the back of a gray Nissan sedan outside the residence late on March 31st. The driver didn't think much of it at the time, but when pressed for specifics, he noted that the bin looked like it was sealed, latches down, wrapped in what he described as clear plastic or something like that. This statement, though not visual evidence, was recorded under affidavit and corroborated with GPS records from the delivery platform. It placed the driver within 30 feet of the property at 11:16 p.m., inside the timeline already under review. For prosecutors, the case was moving out of circumstantial territory. The bin was not just missing, it had become the focal point of disposal. Every movement around it had a timestamp. Every change of location left digital noise, and every object tied back to a common chain of acquisition and concealment. For investigators, this stage of the case wasn't about motive. It was about proving logistics. Who bought what, when, and why those purchases aligned with a woman who never returned home. By April 7, 2025, investigators had exhausted every interior lead. The timeline was intact. The purchase trail confirmed. The digital signals aligned. But without a body, everything remained 1 degree removed from certainty. That shifted the focus to the forest. Cedarville State Forest spans nearly 3,500 acres of woodland, creeks, and overgrown access roads. Dense, irregular terrain. The kind of place where footprints vanish quickly and wind carries scent unevenly. The suspect's cell data had placed him there, but GPS pings only got them within a radius. Locating a specific burial site in that environment wasn't a matter of luck. It required forensic sequencing. They began with soil. Samples collected from the home, specifically from the door frame between the kitchen and the garage, had already shown red clay with root fragments not found in the property's yard. Forensic geologists compared them to mapped sectors of the forest. A match was found within Grid 6C, a clearing just off a service trail typically used by utility trucks. It was isolated but accessible. The soil match didn't prove what was buried. It only proved something had been carried. A team deployed at first light. Cadaver dogs led. Officers marked GPS coordinates in 25-meter sweeps. Within hours, one of the K9s stopped. A hard alert. The dog circled, lowered itself, and lay down. The strongest indicator of human decomposition. The site was secured immediately. Forensic dig teams arrived with archaeological brushes and biometric cameras. They didn't uncover a full body. What they found instead was a sealed plastic bin, half submerged in a shallow depression under disturbed pine needles and moist soil. The lid was duct-taped closed. Over it, a contractor-grade trash bag had been loosely wrapped, not fully tied. When they opened it, the odor confirmed what the cameras could not. Inside was the body of a young woman in advanced decomposition. She was wrapped in clear painter's plastic, arms bound with zip ties and fully clothed. The contents were preserved well enough to allow identification through dental records, which had been provided by Lesbia's dentist just 2 days earlier. Positive match confirmed by April 9th. Pathologists conducted a preliminary external exam at the scene. There were signs of blunt force trauma to the cranial region, multiple contusions, one fracture above the left orbital ridge, no defensive wounds visible. The remains were transported to the state medical examiner's office for full autopsy. There were no personal items in the bin, no phone, wallet, or jewelry. Whoever placed her there had removed everything unnecessary, but they missed one thing: a single fingernail, snapped with red polish partially flaked off, had dried blood beneath it. Forensics preserved it for DNA testing. The nail was collected from inside the plastic wrapping, suggesting it detached post-mortem during transport. The medical examiner's office confirmed the cause of death on April 11th. Blunt force trauma to the head, with additional compression to the chest area, consistent with post-injury placement in an airtight environment. Time of death aligned with the window between 11:30 p.m. on March 31st and 1 a.m. April 1st. The forest didn't just give back the body, it gave back a timeline that couldn't be walked back, erased, or cleaned. For the first time in this case, investigators had the one thing the suspect couldn't explain away: a physical, verifiable, decomposing reality. In cases like this, justice starts not with what's said, but with what's recovered. With the recovery of Lesbia Ramirez-Guerra's body confirmed by dental records, the investigation shifted from scene processing to suspect containment. Detectives already had physical evidence, digital movement logs, and now a confirmed cause of death. The next step was pressure, structured, procedural, and time-sensitive. On April 11, 2025, investigators brought Kesey Robinson Alexis Barrera Rosa back in for formal questioning under a custodial interview. No arrest yet. But the conditions had changed. He was no longer just the reporting party. He was the central figure in a homicide investigation. The interview was conducted in a controlled setting at the Charles County Sheriff's Office. Standard procedure. The room was audio and video recorded. A Miranda warning was issued and acknowledged. His initial statements remained consistent with his earlier claim that Lesbia left the night of March 31st after an argument and never returned. But under controlled questioning, his responses began to diverge. Detectives introduced the Walmart footage. He denied recognizing himself. They showed him the time-stamped receipt. He claimed it was fake. They presented GPS metadata. He had no explanation. Finally, they brought up the plastic bin. The same model, the same dimensions, recovered with Lesbia's body inside. His only response was silence. Legally, this was still pre-charge positioning. Investigators weren't expecting a confession. What they needed was inconsistency, and he gave them that. His phone data, his movement pattern, and his purchase history had created a timeline of deception. His denial of the Walmart purchase directly contradicted visual evidence. His account of staying home was disproven by tower data, and his refusal to acknowledge the plastic bin, central to both the disposal method and the location, severed his credibility. Back at the scene, analysts re-examined the clothing recovered with Lesbia's body. Fiber analysis identified traces of carpet consistent with the hallway inside the Park Waldorf Lane residence. Additional hair samples, not belonging to the victim, were logged, and a partial male DNA profile was recovered from the zip ties used to bind her. Testing was expedited under probable cause conditions. The partial profile matched the suspect's CODIS-linked immigration intake record from 2019. While not a full genetic profile, it fell within the accepted match threshold for probable cause under Maryland statute. That, combined with the totality of forensic and digital evidence, justified immediate escalation. On April 12, 2025, a warrant was executed for Barrera Rosa's arrest on charges of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and providing false information in a missing person investigation. He was taken into custody without incident and held without bond. That same day, a secondary individual was also brought in. Rolvin Eduardo Barrera, the suspect's uncle. Through separate investigation, it was determined that he had assisted in transporting the plastic bin to Cedarville State Forest during the early hours of April 1st. Phone records and vehicle tracking data tied his car to a brief, unexplained stop in Grid 6C, less than 40 minutes after the primary suspect's phone left the area. Under pressure, he admitted involvement. He claimed he didn't know what was inside the bin. His statement was recorded. It wasn't exculpatory. Legally, his admission constituted accessory after the fact. Charges were filed accordingly. At this point, the case had passed the threshold for trial, but the investigation wasn't over. Prosecutors needed a clear procedural narrative, not just for court, but for a jury. Every movement, every contradiction, every trace needed to hold. Because in the absence of a confession, the chain of evidence had to speak louder than any one voice. Lesbia had been silenced, but the data, the movements, the receipts, the soil, they hadn't. They spoke in sequences and timestamps, and now they were speaking in court language. By mid-April 2025, the case of Lesbia Ramirez Guerra transitioned into the pretrial phase. The investigative work had reached legal maturity, meaning it was no longer a question of building suspicion. Now the focus shifted to preserving the integrity of what was already known. On April 15th, Charles County prosecutors filed a formal indictment for first-degree murder against Kesey Robinson Alexis Barrera Rosa. The grand jury was unanimous. Evidence presented included the Walmart surveillance footage, the digital timeline reconstruction, the forensic match between the zip-tie DNA and the suspect's immigration record, and the discovery of Lesbia's body in a sealed plastic bin, consistent with the bin purchased days prior. The sequence was clean, the narrative linear. The motive, though still unstated, was no longer legally necessary to proceed. Defense counsel requested a delay, citing the complexity of digital evidence. The judge allowed a 10-day continuance for discovery review. Prosecutors used that time to consolidate forensic reports, verify lab certifications, and conduct witness preparation sessions, particularly with the forensic anthropologist and lead digital analyst. The defense leaned on three strategies: challenge chain of custody, question the reliability of the soil trace used to identify the burial site, and cast doubt on the credibility of the secondary witness. The uncle, Rolvin Eduardo Barrera, who had admitted to helping move the plastic bin, but claimed he did not know what was inside. The defense's key argument during pretrial hearings centered on contamination. They suggested the DNA recovered from the zip tie could have been the result of environmental transfer, not direct contact. Forensic response. The zip ties were sealed in place, beneath the wrapping, in a controlled environment with no third-party exposure. That countered the contamination claim. The court ruled the DNA evidence admissible. Prosecutors also introduced a forensic voice analysis, not to establish guilt, but to reinforce context. They presented a background recording from a security camera inside the residence that, weeks before Lesbia's disappearance, captured a verbal exchange containing threats of harm. No video, only muffled partial audio. The defense attempted to suppress it, citing lack of clarity. The judge allowed the clip with expert transcription and proper redaction. By April 25th, the court had cleared the majority of forensic exhibits. Admissibility was granted for digital movement logs and tower data, Walmart surveillance and purchase receipt DNA trace on zip ties, audio from residence camera fiber match between interior carpet and victim's clothing, Soil comparison between home and forest burial site jury selection was scheduled for early summer, pending immigration-related status checks on potential witnesses. Due to the defendant's undocumented status and the sensitive nature of victim documentation, the prosecution coordinated with DHs to shield vulnerable witnesses from exposure during testimony. At this stage, no plea had been entered. The defendant maintained his right to silence. His uncle, already charged as an accessory after the fact, remained in protective custody as a state witness. Trials do not begin with verdicts. They begin with control of narrative, evidence, and presentation. In this case, every component of the story had been built on physical action, not just allegation. And once those physical truths entered the courtroom, they began to speak for themselves. On April 25, 2025, Kesey Robinson Alexis Barrera Rosa was formally arraigned in Charles County Circuit Court. The charges: first-degree murder, second-degree murder, false statement to law enforcement, and tampering with evidence. The judge denied bond. The court deemed him a flight risk and a danger to the community. His defense offered no plea deal. He remained silent. The state moved forward with preparations for trial. But for the investigators, the arrest wasn't closure, it was procedure. What had begun with a missing persons call had ended with a sealed body in the woods and a digital trail that couldn't be erased. Alongside him, his uncle, Rolvin Eduardo Barrera, was charged as an accessory after the fact. He admitted transporting the plastic bin, but continued to claim he didn't know what was inside. The prosecution didn't need intent. His phone's GPS confirmed presence at the dump site. His sentence would depend on cooperation moving forward. No family from Guatemala was able to travel for Lesbia's remains. She was buried in a small cemetery on the edge of Waldorf, Maryland, paid for by donations raised through local immigrant support networks. A pastor who had never met her performed the service. No eulogy, no photos, just a name and 2 dates carved into stone. Lesbia's 2 children, both under 5, were placed under the care of Maryland's Department of Social Services. No next of kin was available in the U.S. by court order. Their identities and location remained sealed. Community groups, particularly those working with undocumented women and domestic violence survivors, used the case to highlight a failure in protective infrastructure. Lesbia had searched for help. She had prepared to leave. She had made plans. But the legal system doesn't always operate on intention. It operates on proof. And by the time proof arrived, she was already in a bin, buried in a forest. The case generated limited national coverage. There were no front-page headlines, no long interviews. But for those who followed the investigation, especially in Maryland law enforcement, it became a clear case study on the value of environmental forensics, tower data sequencing, and behavioral indicators that don't always look like distress at first glance. In May, prosecutors announced they would seek a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Under Maryland law, premeditation combined with concealment and body disposal supported the maximum charge. A jury trial was anticipated for late 2025. If convicted, Barrera Rosa would serve his sentence in a federal detention facility due to his undocumented status and IC detainer. There was no confession, no apology, no justification, only silence. The same silence Lesbia had lived with in the final weeks of her life. What this case illustrates isn't only about the horror of a single crime. It's about how easily someone can disappear in plain sight. How domestic violence, especially within undocumented communities, often goes unreported until it's too late. And how forensic science, the details, the data, the small, overlooked evidence, can still speak when the victim no longer can. Justice in this case came not from a dramatic confession or a courtroom breakdown, but from the ability to reconstruct reality piece by piece without bias or speculation. A trash bag, a receipt, a location ping. They told the story that no one else could. Lesbia didn't get to say goodbye, but her silence wasn't the end. It became the evidence. There's something I want to say before we end this story. As someone who's lived through too many cases like Lesbia's, as someone who's had to watch the aftermath unfold behind closed doors, here's what I've learned. Silence can be fatal. If you're in a relationship where fear feels normal, that is not safety. And if someone you know has changed, grown quieter, more isolated, Don't ignore it. Ask the hard questions, because waiting to act after someone disappears is often too late. What do you think we as a community can do better? How do we reach the unheard? If this video meant something to you, leave a comment below. Tell me what city you're watching from, or even what part of this story hit hardest. And hey, if you didn't like the video, I'd still love to know why. Your voice matters here. If you're new, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next case. Until then, stay aware, stay kind, and stay safe.